Hello, this is Professor Keeling, and we're going to talk about analyzing pedigrees today to allow you to analyze human genetic inheritance as well as from other organisms. So the key to analyzing pedigrees is first to understand the pedigree rules so that you know how to read a pedigree. So what we're looking at here is the pedigree for a type of genetic deafness. So as you probably know, deafness can be caused in multiple ways, but some forms of deafness are inherited. And most of the genetically inherited deafness is inherited as a recessive trait. So if this is a recessive trait, that means that in order to be deaf, you have to have both little d alleles. In order to be non-deaf, you just need at least one of the wild-type dominant big D alleles. So if we look at this pedigree here, what we see is a family, right? Pedigrees are showing family relationships. And what we have are 2 parents and 3 children. And the individual colored in on a pedigree always means that's an individual who is showing the trait, has the particular phenotype that we're following. So in this pedigree, this first son over here is deaf. Neither of his parents are deaf, and neither his brother nor his sister are deaf. Now, how I know that he's a boy and not a girl is because he's drawn as a square and not a circle. So this is how you identify the sex of individuals in a pedigree. The other thing about identifying individuals in a pedigree is that generations are numbered with Roman numerals. So the parents in this pedigree would be Roman numeral 1. The 3 children are Roman numeral 2. And then if you want to talk about specific individuals in the pedigree, you give them Arabic numerals. So in this case, the father, the square, is Roman numeral 1-1, and the mother is Roman numeral 1-2. So now that we know what we're looking at in the pedigree and we know how to talk about different individuals, you can start making inferences about genotypes based on the phenotypes. Okay, so if you want to infer genotypes based on phenotypes, you start with the individual whose genotype you can figure out first. So in this case, that's any individual showing the recessive trait. So in order to be deaf, the individual has to be little d, little d. Now, if you look at his parents, just from their phenotypes, all you know is that they must have at least one dominant allele because that's what allows them to not be deaf. And since you don't know the second allele, at least initially, you just represent that as a line. So the line means, or the dash means, it could be a big D allele, it could be a little d allele. But in fact, now that they've had kids, we know more about them. So in order for the son to be deaf, he has to have inherited a little d allele from his father and inherited a little d allele from his mother. And therefore, you know that there had to have been a little d allele in both the mother and the father. And therefore, we know that in fact both parents had to be heterozygous. So now let's look at his siblings. If we look at his siblings, again, all we know right now is that they have to have at least one dominant allele. But let's say his sister actually ends up having a kid, and she has a child who is deaf. Well, now we have additional information. We know that her child, so that's now individual 3-1, is little d. And therefore, by the same logic as before, that individual must have inherited a small d recessive allele from his mother, and so she must be a heterozygote. And in fact, we also know that the father had to be a heterozygote because he also had to be able to pass on a little d allele. So notice that when you're analyzing the pedigree, you often are working backwards from information you know about the children, you work back to a previous generation. So you can use pedigrees like this to calculate probabilities. So let's say that individuals 2-3 and 2-4 have another kid, and we don't know the phenotype of their other child yet. And so we don't know whether they're deaf or not. That's why they show up as a question mark. But you can calculate the probability that this child would be deaf based on what you know about probability rules from analyzing crosses. So remember that in order for you to calculate the probability of any final event, you need to figure out, well, what individual events have to happen, and then you would multiply them by each other. So in this case, what would have to happen in order for this new child to be deaf is that he or she would have to inherit a little d allele from one parent and a little d allele from the other parent. And so if we want to represent that written out, we would write the probability that individual 3, 2, the next person, is little d, and then that would be equal to the probability of getting a little d from the mother, which is a half, because there's two different alleles, and an equal chance of passing on either one. And the probability of this individual inheriting a little d from the father is also a half. So the overall probability in this case that this individual would be deaf would be 1/4, a half times a half. Now notice this pedigree that we've been playing with, this has been showing a recessive trait. And so in that case, individuals who are colored in, we know their genotype has to be 2 recessive alleles, so homozygous recessive. But what if you were looking at a pedigree for a dominant trait instead? So here we're looking at another ear phenotype, which is having detached or attached earlobes, as shown in the pictures. It turns out that having a detached earlobe is dominant over having an attached earlobe. So here's a family where we have 2 parents who each are showing, in this case, the dominant trait, because that's the trait that we're following in this pedigree. So the trait we're following is detached earlobes. Again, you color in individuals who are showing that trait. They both have detached earlobes. They have a child with attached earlobes. So now we do the same thing. We look at the phenotypes and we look at what can we infer about genotypes. And what we know is that each individual showing the dominant phenotype must have at least one dominant allele. We're going to use the letter E here. So they're both capital E, and then we don't know yet about the second allele. We look at their daughter, and she has attached earlobes, which is recessive, so she must be little e, little e. And now by the same logic we used before, we know that both parents must actually be heterozygous because they both have to be able to pass on a little e allele to their offspring. So now that you know some basic rules of pedigrees, how to infer genotypes from phenotypes, and how to use them to calculate probabilities, you're going to do some practice pedigrees in the actual lab activity.